Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a customer engineer focused on management technologies. Today's discussion is part 5 of a series focused on endpoint protection in Intune, which of course is part of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. The focus of today's discussion will be to detail the capabilities and function of the disk encryption settings in Intune, right? So as we get started, here's our agenda. Talk about what disk encryption is, and then what it is as we factor in Intune integration, why we care about it in both scenarios. We'll talk about some of the requirements of disk encryption, show a little bit about how it works. We'll talk through some scenarios. I will show you configuring this, and then we will wrap up the session. So as we kick this off, really, set some context. Why are we talking about this? Well, this is true for every session in the series, and certainly every session we talk about, but a main key thing is awareness, right? These are built-in management capabilities in the management tool that you have, as well as built-in capabilities that are within the operating system that you likely have. And so understanding these and knowing how to use them is really, really important. Also, potential cost savings. If you're using a third-party disk encryption solution, disk encryption management solution, then maybe there would be opportunities there to save cost by reducing infrastructure or whatever. And then, all the reasons that are surrounding that. All right, so jumping right in. So what is disk encryption? We likely all know what disk encryption is, but just to hit it real quick, it's the idea of taking a disk and the data on it and encrypting it in such a way that that is protected so that if you were to remove the hard drive, you couldn't just plug it into another machine and be able to access the data on that disk. It needs to be plugged into a system that is protected with disk encryption software. Typically, this is going to be something you want to do at enterprise scale because this is something that you're going to want to apply to all of the devices in your organization to protect them against theft. If a machine is stolen, if a drive is stolen, then basically the data on that drive is protected and the person who has the drive can't plug it in and just access it straight away, right? So all of that. Now, what is disk encryption related to integration with Intune? Well, specifically, Intune provides a number of settings that allow you to configure exactly how disk encryption will be implemented in your scenario. So there's actually 2 places that we can go configure disk encryption, and frankly, there are 2 areas that we can go configure any of the endpoint protection configurations largely, right, in Intune. They're going to largely be under the endpoint security node or under the configuration profiles node. You're going to see both here. In the other sessions, I've largely just focused on endpoint security. There's reasons that I'm going to show you both specifically here that we will detail. And regardless of the node you select, you can configure either Bitlocker or FileVault setting, which kind of pulls back the covers on the fact that disk encryption is supported on both Windows and Mac OS devices. So we will definitely see that. So more to come on the specific areas you go to configure and why we care. And never forget also that all of the things that you see in the user interface are basically implementations through the configuration service provider, which is part of MDM, right? And so you could, if you wanted to, for whatever reason, go and implement these things yourself through using the custom configuration service provider option, if that's interesting. We're not going to talk about that in this session, but certainly possible, right? Also, disk encryption and Intune integration will include a number of different management scenarios. We will talk about several scenarios in this session, and I will show them to you. reporting is a big deal. So being able to have a rich reporting of your disk encryption status across the enterprise. Again, enterprise scale. Now, I'm going to put an asterisk here because there is one interesting thing with reporting that I want to highlight, and we will when we get to it. But very rich reporting capabilities for sure in the Intune integration. And then there's also an opportunity for potentially reduced infrastructure. For example, on the Windows side, if maybe you're maintaining an MBAM infrastructure to support managing BitLocker, then since all of that is capable and integrated into Intune, then I say all of that. There's probably some things that aren't parity exactly, but the basic functionality and what you would need likely as an administrator for doing various things is definitely an Intune. Then there might be a potential there that you could retire your MBAM infrastructure and not have to maintain that separate solution going forward. And then with Intune, you will find certainly there's some things you want to understand and configure when it relates to BitLocker, but once you figure out, and FileVault really, but once you figure out your path forward on how you're going to do this, then actually going and implementing the configurations for that, pretty straightforward. And then last thing, as far as what is Disk Encryption Intune integration, is with Intune, you have the ability to implement role-based access controls that will help you hone the console to just the experience that you need to have, right? And so that could apply across with help desk operators and different things, right? Again, you don't necessarily need those individuals to have the vision into the full Intune console, but maybe certain areas where they need to manage and so on. Role-based access, that's all I'm going to say about it, really out of the scope for here. Just know that it is a possibility and for sure a capability that you can use. Okay. So now, why do we care about disk encryption? Well, a few reasons. One, the ability to encrypt your disks and have that security on your disks is integrated into Windows 10. BitLocker is the option for Windows 10. Also integrated with Mac OS, FileVault is the option. And so having these at your fingertips and likely wanting to increase the security of your enterprise, then why wouldn't you want to understand these capabilities, right? Integrating this is really seamless, either largely seamless or completely seamless, meaning that user data can be protected with zero to minimal interaction needed by the user. And that's one of the scenarios we'll talk about. Secure, so being able to reduce the risk of compromising corporate data is a big deal. And then finally, performance. If we're going to encrypt the disk, you're going to want to do that in a way that does not compromise the performance of the system. And so typically, there's only a very small performance overhead associated with disk encryption. Often it's going to be in the low single-digit percentages of performance, and maybe even less than that, right? So why disk encryption? All of these reasons, and probably even more. Why do we care about disk encryption whenever it comes to Intune integration? Well, first one, built in, these capabilities are built into your management tool. And so being able to quickly, easily bring them to bear to help you secure your environment is really, really helpful. Having this integrated with Intune gives you a great deal of flexibility. There's several different scenarios you will hear in just a minute. Anything from user-driven to completely silent to configuration options that include TPM, don't include TPM, allow for pins, don't allow for pins, all of what you frankly need in your scenario, we can help you with. You by using Intune integration can enforce these configurations so that devices across your enterprise will be BitLocker protected or FileVault protected, or they just will have less access to your environment. So compliance. The detection of disk encryption is a very heavily leverage piece of determining whether a device is compliant. So if your disk is encrypted, then organizations typically will set that as a requirement for having the device be compliant along with other things. And if it's not encrypted, then the device won't be compliant. Why is that a big deal? Because device compliance is a key indicator, not the only one for sure, but a key indicator in whether the device is able to navigate successfully conditional access requirements to get access to your corporate data. So the gatekeeper here might be compliant devices are required to be able to access corporate data. And so one of the compliance checks would be on disk encryption. So that's certainly an option for sure. Consistency. Using something like Intune to help deploy your policies and requirements to devices across your enterprise just points to consistency as you build, as you target and deploy devices in your enterprise. And then recovery and security is another reason. So anytime we encrypt the disk, we're going to also want to have a way to recover in case there is a problem and we need to go through and recover and get access to that disk. Like maybe there's a hardware change and we have to supply the recovery key to get in. And certainly Intune can help with that. All right, so what are the requirements specifically of disk encryption and managing that through Intune? Well, of course, in order to manage disk encryption through Intune, you need Intune, so that's the first one. The next is TPM. Now, notice I have an asterisk beside TPM, because TPM is, while it's in all modern scenarios, likely you're going to use TPM. It is not strictly required in every single scenario. If you're going to use TPM, it needs to be TPM 1.2 or 2.0, and it has to be unlocked. And then there are some configurations that you probably want to use that will require TPM 2.0 only. You're going to need WinRE enabled and configured on your device with proper partitioning. Proper partitioning means that the OS partition is formatted in TFS. The system partition has at least 350 megabytes or more available and is formatted either FAT32, and that is for UEFI, or NTFS if in BIOS mode, right? All those details, don't worry about them. You can get those in the documentation pretty easily. UEFI also has an asterisk by it. The reason I put an asterisk there is because if you're going to be using a UEFI device, then you need to have TPM 2.0 devices. That's a requirement. And then the device needs to be either Azure AD or hybrid Azure AD joined. And then finally, the supported OSs would be Windows 10 or Mac OS. So Mac OS 10.13 and later, Windows 10 Enterprise, Professional, and Education. If you're using Pro, just know that there are some limitations as to what you can do with Pro. Bitlocker is supported, right? But a broader set of capabilities on non-Pro devices. Certainly the required permission and then groups for being able to target the policy for disk encryption. Okay, so how does this work specifically? So this really isn't a how it works slide as much as it is a life cycle slide for BitLocker management. I'm not going to read this to you. You can kind of see it. It kind of makes sense where all these pieces factor in as far as readiness and recovery keys and compliance and so on, right? But wanted to at least show this. This is part of our documentation too. If you want to see it again, you'll probably see it in our documentation. All right, so moving on to the fun stuff, and that is starting to get into the scenarios, seeing how this works, and so forth. So there's a few scenarios that I want to show you here. The first are encryption scenarios, specifically with BitLocker, and then specifically with FileVault for Mac OS. So on the BitLocker side, there's 3 scenarios I'm going to show you. Well, at least 3 scenarios we'll talk about, 2 of which I will show you. The first is user-driven, and that is where the user is required to interact minimally to get disk encryption started, right? The other is silent, which is likely what a lot of organizations will probably prefer, where you can encrypt devices and the user doesn't have to even be aware of it, right? It just happens in the back end. There's a third one, which we'll talk about, called automatic encryption. Then we'll talk about FileVault. I want to show you some administration and reporting things as well as we wrap up the scenario. So let's just jump right in. So in terms of the first scenario, Bitlocker user-driven, there's really a couple of options here. First option is you can have TPM and non-TPM devices if you like. You can use a PIN and do manual unlock scenarios and so on. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but I want to show this to you in general, right? So, okay. So pulling in the console for a minute. So let's go take a look. First of all, I mentioned that there's two pathways for configuring drive encryption, disk encryption, right? Certainly we're talking about Bitlocker here, and we're talking about user-driven. So there really are two pathways to configure user-driven for sure, right? Now, one thing, I'm going to show you both the option under the endpoint security node and also the option under the device configuration node. I'm just going to show them to you right now. The node that we're going to use for the user-driven is going to be the endpoint security node. That's where I have some sample policy configured. As of the time of this recording, and I actually believe this is an oversight that I've communicated as of this recording to the product team, is you're going to see different options if you go through the device configuration pathway to do these configurations versus if you go through the endpoint security pathway. This is one of the only areas where that's true, right? I can't think of another area right now where that's true, and that's why I believe this is an oversight. Certainly for FileVault, which you'll see in a little bit, that's not true, but it is here, and so that's why I believe this is an oversight, right? But let me show both of them to you. So I'm going to start with device configuration. And so as soon as it, okay, so here we go. I'm going to start with device configuration profiles. And so I'm just going to jump straight to a device configuration profile that I have created for manual. So you can see the options. You'll actually come back. We'll use this for silent, as you see in just a minute. But let's look at properties on it now. And so if I go look at the configuration options, what I want you to do is take a mental snapshot of this, right? So here's my Windows encryption. And so take a mental snapshot as I scroll down. You see options for Windows settings. You see BitLocker base settings. You see the options for encryption. You see OS drive encryption. You see options for TPM and pin length and so on, right? And then you see other options as I scroll down. So this is the full list of configuration options through the device configuration node. Now, let's go to the endpoint security node. And so if we look at the endpoint security node and we go down to disk encryption, and then we look at our configure BitLocker policy, and you actually see we have two greens here. Go to properties, and then I scroll down and I look at the configuration options. Again, compare your mental snapshot from what you just saw to here. And what you're going to see is there are certain options that are just not here. So you do have your base settings and your fixed drive settings and so on, but in your OS drive settings and removable drive settings. But what do you miss? You don't see TPM settings. You don't see pin settings. You don't see some of the other critical settings that are needed to be able to configure all of the different scenarios and options that you would like, right? Now, what is here, again, is plenty to be able to do the user-driven kind of encryption. And so we will do that. And so what I have configured here, and my goal in this session is certainly not to take you through every single configuration option and explain in detail what it is. No, I'm just going to show you where it is. It's up to you to investigate these settings and what they do and what you want them to do, and so on, right? So all I've got done is basically I'm enabling full disk encryption. Notice full disk encryption, not partial. What I want to do with uh, uh, storage cards and so on, and then when I do the encryption, what kind of scenario I want for recovery, whether it's allowed, not configured, required, blocked, whatever, how I want to configure that up, what other options I have as far as recovery options, what encryption method I want to use. And so the default on these encryption methods is 128-bit. I'm using 256, so we can actually look at the device and confirm that it was encrypted by other than the default policy. And that's really all I'm going to show you here in terms of the options for configuring, because really that's not my point, is to go option by option by option. That's something you can do. But I want to show you it's there. And then I also want to show you that this is assigned. And so I have an assignment to a group of Windows 10, which actually includes just one device, right? And so if I go back and look at my per settings status, so I'm not even showing you the device yet. Let me look at per settings status. What you're going to see is that for my one device that I've deployed this to, my report on per settings status shows me success. Now, here's a question. If you were to look at this and see success, what would you think that means? And almost certainly, because I've asked this question, almost certainly what you think that means is that the device has encrypted its disks based on the policy that you have supplied to it. And I would too. That's not true, right? What this is showing you is that the device has actually received the policy successfully, not that the device has encrypted itself successfully. Keep this in mind. This is also something I've raised to the product team because I just don't think we have enough clarity here. Let me be clear. We do have an option that will show you the precise status of that device when it comes to disk encryption. This is not it. This is telling you that we have, in fact, applied the policy to the device successfully, right? Now, how do I know that? Because if I go into a Windows 10 device, this is the one device that I've targeted with this policy. Okay, there's a few things I'm going to notice. First of all, in my notification area, see that I have one notification. If I click on that notification, it's going to tell me that encryption is needed. If this device were encrypted, I wouldn't need to encrypt it because it's already encrypted, right? If I click on this notification, it's going to ask me, are you ready to start encrypting? If I was already encrypted, I wouldn't need to encrypt, right? And so now let's talk about this too. This is the user-driven scenario. I don't expect this device to be encrypted. The user needs to interact. But I also don't expect my Intune console to say successful, meaning in my mind, successfully encrypted, when it isn't successfully encrypted. So that's why I call this out, right? What you're seeing on the device is absolutely expected, right? So I'm going to click no. And if I go to Control Panel and I look at Bitlocker in the Control Panel, then you're going to see that Bitlocker is, in fact, not enabled, right? So it's not turned on. Now, if I go into the event viewer, which is down here, there are two event logs that are interesting for Bitlocker, Bitlocker API and Bitlocker Drive Preparation Tool. Neither one of them have any events in the event log. The one that you would expect to see events on is management, and neither one of them have events, none of them. And so again, Bitlocker encryption has not been attempted on this device, but let's go to the registry. So one of the things that I try to highlight is where you can go to see different configurations that are in place, right? And the registry certainly is a place that we can go. So let's go take a look at the registry. Okay. All right. And so now, notice, so one thing, right, that I want to call out first of all. As we go into the registry, do I want to show it here or do I want to wait? Yeah. So as we go into the registry, we will be able to look at certain configurations that are in place, on the device. And forgive me, I realized I was looking at the wrong registry key, so this is the right one, right? So if we go, I was going to wait and show you this. I might as well show it to you now. So local machine, software, Microsoft Policy Manager, current device, Bitlocker. So you want to look under current. You don't want to look under default, because default, actually, if I go down, default is not showing me my current settings, right? It's showing me what is the default configuration. But if I look under current, it will. And so for Bitlocker, these are the settings that have been copied down to the device. Now, what I do expect, what I am seeing in the Intune console, is that the policy has arrived at the device successfully. How do I know it's arrived at the device successfully? Because I'm getting prompted to turn on Bitlocker, right? I'm seeing required device encryption is set to 1, which is true. That's not default. And so I know that the policy has arrived, right? So that's a really good place to look. A little bit more about the registry, right? So again, under the covers of Intune, any configuration we do is being implemented through what's called a configuration service provider that is part of MDM on the Windows device. Those settings are stored specifically under the registry hive for that configuration service provider and all of those things that get copied down there. If you were to go look for this in GPO or whatever, it wouldn't be there because it's a different place that we put the settings on, or generally it wouldn't be there. There's some exceptions, right? So anyway, this is a good place to confirm that the setting has arrived the way you think it should, and so forth, right? So that's why I show this to you. But the point of this discussion is that we did configure this, absolutely, but configuring it is not enforcing it. Enforcing it would be something like silent mode encryption, which we don't have enabled, at least here. This is going to require user interaction, right? Interesting. Okay, I'm going to refresh that. For some reason, that went away and said I'm not connected. But anyway, so I'm going to minimize that, right? Okay, now a screenshot that I took, I showed that to you live. I took this screenshot too because I missed the pop-up. So this is the pop-up that you will see when that policy arrives, the user base telling the user, hey, encryption is needed. Then it just stays in the notification center until the user notices it, right? Okay, so that's user-driven. Now, silent mode encryption. So the options here, basically no user interaction is required. There are some requirements that are specific to the silent scenario, such as you need TPM. If the user on the device is an administrator, then you need to have Windows 10 1803. If the user is a standard user, then you need Windows 10 1809. Just like anything else, you need this device to be hybrid AD or Azure AD joined, and the BIOS needs to be set to native UEFI, right? So let's actually go look at this and see how it is configured. Okay, so now before we get into the console, right? The same comments apply. There are again two sections where you can go do configuration. One is the endpoint security node. That's what I just showed you. That's where the user-driven was done. Then there's configuration profiles that you can deploy. I've shown you that already. With silent installation, the options that you need are not present in the endpoint security node. So all of our demo, you've already seen this a minute ago, will be done through the configuration profile node, right? So as we go into that node, and let me pull in the Intune console here. All right, so here we go. Now, I'm going to go directly to the devices node and the configuration profiles section here. All right, and sorry, configuration profiles. Back. Devices, and then configuration come on. Configuration profiles. There we go. All right, so this section will go in and look at the Bitlocker silent configurations. And so if I look at, you'll see that it shows success 2. I mentioned earlier what that meant. We'll see if we actually were successful here in just a second. So properties, and we will then see how we're configured. Now, there are a couple, in order to actually set up and do a silent encryption, there are a couple of settings that have to be configured a certain way. So if we go under Microsoft Encryption, well, of course, we do need to make sure that encrypting of the devices is required. There's this option, warning for other disk encryption. I'm blocking that right now. Let me talk about it for a second. This is a good setting because, look, if you have devices that are encrypted by a third-party disk encryption solution, and then you try to do that with Bitlocker on top, that could end up badly for you, right? So that warning is there by default, but if you have that warning pop up, that's going to block silent encryption. And so you need to disable that warning, which is effectively what you're doing when you block that warning. The other option is that you need to allow standard users to enable encryption during AD join. That needs to be set that way. And then a final option that needs to be, and you see that I'm doing 256-bit encryption for all of my drives. Just again, that's to show you that the encryption works. And then the other option, additional authentication at startup, is not configured because, again, we want this to be silent, right? So all the other settings here, I don't really care about. Again, these are ones that you can dig into. That's not the point of this, is to go through every single Bitlocker setting, but instead to show you that these are here and that this is workable and easily manageable in the Intune side of this. And so while I'm here, I'm going to go back and look at the per settings configuration here. And we see the same thing that we saw before, that we are showing compliant devices, right? Now, the other one was, as I believe, written success, right? Here, it's compliant devices, compliant with this policy. So just a difference in label, just a different section of the console, right? But now let's go to this device here, -11, and this is where the silent policy was applied. And so I'm going to log into it. And here's our desktop. And we're going to see immediately that the notification area has no notifications, right? So nothing's pending. And then if we look in the control panel, we're going to see that Bitlocker is, in fact, turned on, right? And we see that it's managed by the system administrator. So Bitlocker is turned on, completely managed by the system administrator, no user prompts at all, right? If we go to the event log, we're going to see in our API, the management one, we're going to see, if we go to the top, that there is different stuff going on. All we have to do is open the event, and we can just click through and see resealing going on and different actions related to BitLocker, right? So we see it's enabled is the bottom line. Now, if we drag to the bottom, you probably already noticed that we have some errors, right? So why do we have these errors, right? Well, whenever I first sent out the policy, I did not verify that my DVD drive had been cleared of content. So we did, in fact, try to implement the policy and failed because there was a DVD drive DVD in the virtual DVD drive. So I simply cleared that and let the device sit, and we retried, and encryption then happened completely silently. And you might ask, well, why does it matter if a DVD drive is in there? Well, it does, right? Because one of the things that Bitlocker will look for and detect is whether there's been a change made to the system to tell it to go into recovery mode or whatever. And so a DVD drive is one of those things that if a disk is in the drive, whenever we do the Bitlocker analysis, we will include it in kind of the baseline of the system. And then later, if that DVD would be removed, it would trigger recovery mode. So we just require that it be empty from the beginning, right? So anyway, but it does work. Now, I could also go back into the registry and show you that those settings are there. Really unnecessary at this point since we have already seen that those settings are there. One thing that I will call is that event I just looked at, the error event, is an 853. And so we'll see 853 again as we close out with some troubleshooting tips and tricks, things that might be common for BitLocker errors, and I'll remind you of it then. One other thing that I want to show you is that I can absolutely validate that this device received the policy that I sent down. Really easy. All I've got to do is do a manage BDE status, and it's going to go check the status of BitLocker and come back. Actually, it won't, because as soon as I did that, I realized I didn't open the command prompt or the PowerShell prompt as admin. I need to do that. So let's do that. And so I'm going to run this as administrator, and same thing, manage BDE status, and we get the status. And so I told you that in my policy, I did a 256-bit encryption because that's different than the default. And I wanted you to see that, in fact, the policy that I defined is being put down. And you can see from the output here that, in fact, that is the case. So we are all good. This applied. Everything is as it should be. So we can take the VM out of the picture, and we get back here. And just again, we see that we have a list of compliant devices. In this case, it would be easy to look at this dashboard and think that compliant device means that the policy has been applied correctly, because in this case it was. That's not necessarily the case. In fact, it's not the case. We have a report that will help you with that. We'll get to that in a bit. Okay, so up next, talking about automatic encryption. This is one that I will quickly talk about. It's not one that I will demonstrate because really automatic encryption is something that happens at the OEM. So what this is it's an option to automatically encrypt internal drives. And this is going to be something that takes place during the out-of-box experience phase of setup. To make use of this requires modern standby or HSTI compliant hardware. And again, the device will need to be one that you can assign into with a Microsoft account or Azure AD account. The way this kind of works is that we will do the encryption during the out-of-box experience phase, but we will leave that in a suspended state until a user logs on, and then we'll flip it into being active and go forward from there. Again, that's something that you might want to take advantage of, something that does have certain requirements. So take a look at it if, in fact, that is of interest. All right, so moving on. So we now want to take a look at the options for macOS, and that would be through FileVault. And so the options for FileVault apply in two scenarios. One, you can start with a device that has not been encrypted, and you can encrypt it, right? Or you can start with a device that the user has previously encrypted, and Intune can then take over the management of that encryption on behalf of the user. So I'm not going to show you both of the scenarios. I'm just going to show you what I did to set up the device encryption on my Mac. There's some details you'll see in the configuration that will kind of show you how you can do different things, right? But the documentation is certainly more detailed depending on what scenario you find yourself in. So let's go through and configure this. If I pull in the Intune console again, so I'm going to go back to home and again highlight that we can configure this if we want to through device configuration, no problem. All right, so let me go down and show you configuration profiles. And I do have a option for FileVault. It is not assigned, so this is not the one I'm using, but let me show it to you. So if you look at properties, take a mental snapshot of what you see here. All right. Let me go to configuration. Take a mental snapshot here of the options, right? I'll show you this one. You'll see in a minute why. There's only one option, personal key. And then these, right? So just take a mental snapshot. Now, let's go over to Endpoint Security. And this is where I'm configuring macOS Disk Encryption. So I will go down to Disk Encryption, and you see my policy for FileVault. It is assigned. And so if I go look at the properties here, then look at the configuration. All right, so compare that mental snapshot you took to what you see here. And what you're going to see is that the options are the same. There are a couple of very slight differences, like I showed you the recovery key type. The only option is personal key, so we don't even let you choose it. We just make it the default choice. The rest of them, the same. And so I'm going to use this endpoint security path for demonstrating the configuration, and you'll see it in flight here in just a minute. But a couple of things. So we've enabled FileVault. It's going to be a personal recovery key, right? And I'm choosing, you don't have to, but I'm choosing every 3 months just for this demo, any kind of text that you want to give to the user for the escrow location of the recovery key and so on, right? So pretty straightforward in terms of options. I have this deployed to my device. So let's go back. And I have it assigned to the Mac group, has just one Mac inside of it. And then if I look at the properties, the per setting status, I see that same thing. These have all succeeded. Again, question mark about that, right? We know what that means now, except for this one. And this one is not applicable. So I'm good, right? This worked out just as it should. You see, that's why it says, hey, succeeded. Again, that doesn't really mean succeeded like we think it does. Hopefully, either the product group will tell me that I'm dumb and I don't see it this way myself, or they'll see what I'm seeing and hopefully will make it a little bit clearer. But again, we have a good report that allows us to see the exact status of the device even now. So let me pull the Mac onto the screen. I'll just show you that FileVault is configured. And here it is. Well, if I can grab it. There it comes. Okay, fine. Here it is. So this is my Mac. And so if I go into settings on my Mac and then look under security right there, then I see, in fact, FileVault is turned on, right? So no problem. And so this did get enabled. It's being managed and so on. Really easy thing to show you, not that complicated. So I just wanted to show it to you real quick. I'll get rid of it. And we are good to go. All right. Okay. Now, So again, FileVault, BitLocker, doesn't matter. We can manage just fine. Okay, so that's how to get things configured. Now, what's the next scenario? The next thing I want to talk to you about is the idea of administration, right? Getting it configured is one thing. Being able to understand how you can go administer options is another that you need to be familiar with. So how do we go and configure the different options, or what are the different options, and how do we access them for just general ongoing administration? So there's really a couple I want to talk about. So back in the console, let's go to the devices section. Let's go back home. And so one thing we want to understand is, should the user need access to their recovery key, where is that recovery key stored? So the way it's really stored in a couple of places. So we're going to go to the devices node, and let me say up front, right? There are two ways that you can enroll your devices. They can either be enrolled as personal devices, BYOD, or they can be enrolled as corporate-owned devices. If the device is enrolled as a personally owned device, you will not be able to see the recovery key information, right? It's a personal device. If it's a corporate device, you will be, right, because it's a corporate-owned device. And so there's a couple of pathways by which we can see the recovery keys. We'll start in the devices node of the Intune console. I'll start with Windows, right? And so I'll just pick a Windows device here whenever it comes up. And we'll pick this one. So this is the one that we targeted the user-driven configuration to. We saw that it did not encrypt because we hadn't triggered it. And so it will come as no surprise to you that if we look at the recovery keys option, it will be, hey, big surprise, blank. There's nothing that's going to be here, right? Because nothing has been encrypted on this drive. But if we then go back and we look at this one where encryption did happen normally, and we look at the recovery keys option for it, then we will see that, in fact, we do have recovery key detail available to us, and we can go look at it. We can go show the recovery key and everything that we might want to do, right? The same is true, frankly, if we go and look at our Mac device, so Mac OS, and then we'll select it, and then go to recovery keys, and in fact, now the screen looks a tiny bit different, but we get the same recovery key information, right, by clicking on it. And again, these devices I've just shown you are all three enrolled as corporate. This Mac, when I first enrolled it, it came in as personal. And so whenever I was looking for the recovery key, I clicked what I just did, and it said, nope, you can't see for personal devices. And so I changed it to corporate and waited a bit, and now I can see it without any issue. Now, here's another thing. Let me go to portal.azure.com, because there are several things in the Intune console, if you will, that really pull their detail from the Azure portal and or shortcuts different places, like the conditional access shortcut in the Intune console is really accessing over in Azure AD. This is no different. What you're going to see is that this information, the recovery key detail, is actually stored in Azure AD, right? So here's Azure AD, and we'll wait for that to come up just a minute, right? And then we'll be able to see that, in fact, it is. Okay, so starting to come up. So if I go under Azure AD to devices, then I'm going to see my same Windows device in the list as soon as it populates. Come on. Okay, good. Let's go down to 10-11, which is right here, right? And if I just scroll down to the bottom of the properties list, that is where you're going to see the Bitlocker recovery key info. And in fact, this screen is exactly the same screen as you saw a moment ago. Just that section is pulled out for the Bitlocker recovery key. So it's really stored in Azure AD, but you can easily see it through the without having to leave the Intune console and go over and launch Azure AD. And let's look at MacBook. So MacBook, in fact, yes, is part of Azure AD. It is not joined to Azure AD, but it's part of it. And we don't have the detail here, right? Because it's different. But just wanted to show that to you, just so we could see what's actually there and what some of the differences are, and so on, right? Okay. Now, there is also in the administration side the concept of key rotation, right? So what does that mean? That means that on a periodic basis, or when certain events take place, you might want to update the recovery key. And so I'm going to get rid of the Azure portal. And so that is something that you can configure to do automatically, or you can just trigger it manually. And so, for example, if I go to a Windows device and look at this one, for example, and hit the ellipsis, then there is the BitLocker key rotation right here. So I can trigger that. It'll cause the keys to rotate and store a new one. I can do that on Mac devices as well. So if I go to my Mac device and select the ellipsis over here, then I have rotate FileVault recovery key that I can initiate that way too, right? The other thing is that if your recovery key is actually used to unlock the device, then you can cause that recovery key to rotate. So there's a setting for that. So where do you actually access that setting? So if I go to Endpoint Security, and then I think it's Endpoint Security. Yeah, so let me go to Disk Encryption, and I will look at my BitLocker configuration, and then Properties, and then let's go look at the actual configuration settings. There we go. Okay, so right up here at the top, scroll down, configure client-driven recovery password rotation. So here are my options. What that means is if your recovery key is actually used to recover a device, a drive on a device, that will trigger the key rotation to actually take place, which is just a good thing, right? It's up to you. Some people choose to do that, some people don't, but it is an option that's available to you, right? So, okay, those are the administration things. Now, moving on to our last little scenario that I want to highlight is reporting, and there's one report. So I mentioned already that the settings or the report on the per setting status, the dashboard there, is a bit misleading, right? It doesn't tell the truth, if you will. It does tell the truth. It just doesn't tell you what you think it's telling you. But there is a report that's very, very, very useful for an all-up view of what's going on in the environment. So back in the console here, if I go to devices, and this is something that is easy to overlook, look under monitor. And if you haven't ever looked there, I encourage you to look there because there's a number of things underneath here that could be very interesting to you, right? These different things, different reports and so on. The one that we care about here is Encryption Report. And so this will give an all-up view of your devices, whether they're encrypted, whether they're ready to encrypt, or whatever the case may be, right? So this one is the one that I sent user-driven instructions to, and I never implemented it. It is not encrypted, and in fact, it tells you it's not encrypted, right? Also says that the encryption readiness is not ready to encrypt, but it is encrypted. My Mac is encrypted. My one where I did the silent is encrypted. It has a TPM version, right? Not applicable for Mac, and then unknown here. I don't actually have TPM assigned because I knew I wasn't going to actually manually trigger the encryption, so I really didn't care on this device. But this is a really, 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 really good, helpful dashboard to tell you what all is happening in your environment, right? Okay, so starting to wrap up with some troubleshooting tips and tricks, starting with troubleshooting. So I've already shown you in the registry where you can go access the detail about Bitlocker information being communicated down through the MDM channel to confirm that it's there. I've already shown you in the event logs where we will see activity in the Bitlocker event log indicating what's happening with Bitlocker. Here's just a table of common Bitlocker events, events in that event log and what they mean, right? There's also some messages that you can sometimes get that are not necessarily event related and what they mean. So this may not be the end-all be-all for troubleshooting, but it's certainly useful as you're looking at those event logs to understand what these options are and what they mean and how to work with them and so on. On the tips and tricks side, right, really just want to close out this section by reminding you that we've been talking about Bitlocker here today in Intune and then in a previous series in Config Manager because there is an end of life coming for a common tool that's used to manage Bitlocker in environments called MBAM, Microsoft Bitlocker Administration Management, right? Now, initially, that was set to expire in 2024. We have extended that date to April 14th, 2026, so it gives you ample time to get ready to make the transition. I would absolutely not delay because we've extended that date. You don't want to be at that date or close to it and not have a transition underway to a different tool, right? Then when we talk about Mac OS, just again, tips and tricks here. When you create a policy to encrypt devices that have FileVault, understand that policy is a two-stage application. First, the device is going to be prepared to enable Intune to retrieve and back up the recovery key, basically escrow the recovery key. After that is done, that's when encryption can start, right? We're not going to encrypt until we actually have the recovery key escrowed and so on. The other thing that I did point out to you, but I just want to call out here, the options that you have in the Intune console are for full disk encryption, not partial, right? Now, hope I didn't miss it somewhere and it's there and hidden and I just didn't see it, but it's for full disk encryption. So be aware of that, right? That's where other options. Again, remember, we're giving you the UI options. That does not necessarily mean that those are the only ways that you can implement disk encryption. No, not at all. There's other ways you can do it. You could build a PowerShell script. You can see what's available in the CSP options and so on to tailor it even closer to what you need. But the UI options are what they are, and full disk encryption is what we have. So with that said, we're going to wrap up this session, and we will see you next time.